Welcome, everybody. My name is Jill Jonathan. I'm with Red Wine and Blue. We're a community of women who use digital media and friend to friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. And we have important conversations because we need to get talking. So I always co host these with Joe Carducci, also known as JoJo from Jurors. And today we are so excited. It's the first of a film series. We usually talk to authors, but Kristin is an author as well, so we'll get into that. But we have Kristin Du Mez today, and her new film, For Your Daughters, came out last week, and it's so important, and it's really incredible and really a must watch for everybody. So Kristin, let's just start with your national bestseller book, Jesus and John Wayne. And I think this was the motivation for you then expanding the work into this documentary film. So can you first tell us a little bit about how your book then motivated you to do this film?
Sure. More than 10 years ago, I started researching the topic of evangelical masculinity. There are so many popular books, wildly popular books on Christian manhood. And it was actually my students at a Christian university where I teach who brought these books to my attention and said, you have to read these things. And when I did, I was really shocked at the real militancy that they were promoting under the rubric of Christian manhood. And so I started exploring that topic. And very quickly, I came to see that these views of masculinity shaped the way that men behaved in their families and in their churches, but also in terms of their politics, in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of culture wars politics. And I also started to see that many of the men who were promoting these really militant masculine ideals as intertwined with Christian nationalism also became implicated in abuse scandals, in sexual abuse, in the abuse of power. And so I was watching these spaces for more than a decade. And it was in the fall of 2016 when I knew I really had to do something with this and turn this into a book. And it was in the days after the release of the Access Hollywood tape. When everybody was asking, okay, certainly now white evangelicals, Trump's most stalwart supporters, they've got to drop him now, right? On record, boasting of assaulting women. This conflicts with all their most deeply held values. But of course, that didn't happen. And that's when I knew I needed to write this book because I knew this wasn't a betrayal of their values. We didn't really understand what those values actually were because inside their own communities, they had been defending abusers, perpetrators for a very long time. And so the last chapter of Jesus and John Wayne focuses on survivors in evangelical spaces, incredibly courageous women who have tried to reform the system from within. And this film presents their stories and tries to give them the biggest platform I can.
Ah, well, thank you for your book and thank you for this film. I mean, now more than ever, this is the conversation we absolutely have to be having because it's not just like knocking on the door of the highest office in the land. It's like halfway in the door, and with Mike Johnson there in the position of power and just two people away from that office as well. And after we saw the debate last night, where it's sort of like JD Vance, those creepy vibes that he gives me anyway. Like, I know that creepy might not be the best word, but still, it's crucially important that we have these conversations because you've been watching it all these years, and it's been evolving and growing and gaining in more and more power. And it's interesting because I think so many of us have asked ourselves the same question, like, why would anybody who follows the teachings of Jesus prop this man who is antithetical to all of that, the embodiment of the 7 deadly sins rolled into one person? Why would they, follow him? And you point out something that honestly I had never even really considered, which is like, this is rife in that community where men who can get away with abusing women because they are unchecked will abuse women, children, etc., because they are unchecked. So it actually mirrors, Trump is an abuser. That mirrors the things that they get away with in that community. That is an interesting connection I hadn't yet made.
Yeah, we did not shy away from framing this film in this moment in terms of the Christian nationalist threat, right? That's a thread that runs through the book. And it's that Christian nationalism, the idea that America should be a Christian nation as they understand it. And it needs to be reclaimed as such, defended as such against other Americans, even against other Christians who don't hold their particular views on every political or ideological issue, right? And so there is a Christian nationalist through line because then that has to be defended through militancy, through aggressive actions. And that's what men are for. That's what God made men to do and to be. And you can see the dark side of that in terms of women's lives and in terms of this conception of power, which, so I'm actually a Christian. And as I understand Christian theology, it actually turns worldly power on its head. Right? Christians are supposed to give up power. They're supposed to offer themselves. They're supposed to love their neighbors, love their enemies. And that's the opposite of what we see in this Christian nationalist agenda. But it's not just kind of this abuse of power that is the thread between what's happening on the national stage or poised to happen on the national stage and what's happening inside Christian homes and churches. It's also there are direct links between some of the Christian nationalist preachers who are preaching this patriarchy and women's submission and who are directly working with through networks with authors of Project 2025 with this idea of the Constitution doesn't protect rights as we understand those rights. The Project 2025 explicitly says the Constitution protects the right for you to do what you ought to do, not what you want to do, and they will tell you what you ought to do. The author of the chapter on executive power in Project 2025 is a self identified Christian nationalist and connected to some of the men in this film. So it is a pressing concern. And we thought we need to bring these women and their voices, their stories into the public in this moment because it matters for all Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to talk, I can't remember what the pastor's name was, but one of the scenes that just will always stick with me from the film is the pastor who had sexually assaulted an underage or a woman when she was underage, and then he's up in front of the congregation talking about his sin and asking for forgiveness, and the whole congregation stands up and claps for him. And then you hear from her. Can you talk about that a little
That
bit?
is Jules Woodson's story. Remarkable woman who has, each of these women has stepped up and taken so much heat for doing so inside these religious spaces to try to work for reform. And many of them came to this realization that they needed to say something and do something when they had daughters of their own. And when they understood they were not to blame because they had been blamed for what they
Mhm.
had done, they had been blamed for their own abuse. And this pattern of the perpetrators, if they're even held to any public account, and that's a big if. Usually this is swept under the rug in the name of protecting the man's ministry or protecting the witness of the church. But if they are held to account, this is the common format, right? A quick confession instantly turned into a restoration, and the support and the members of the community, fellow leaders, right, lift him up, applaud him, and promise to support him. Where is the victim in this, right? What happens to women and to children? And those stories are absolutely harrowing. They're the ones, more often than not, who are pushed out of their churches. They're the ones who carry the blame.
Mm. And they're also the ones that they're using to outbreed, right? To outbreed those who are not explicitly their type of Christianity. And women are expected to be mothers, to carry as many babies as possible. There's no birth control. They don't believe in that. So this is another way of forcing, submission of women and forcing them to be, baby making machines.
Yes. And I will say that this is not this kind of pronatalism to in its extreme form of no birth control, having as many babies as humanly possible is not standard across all evangelical spaces by any means. This is from a more radical fringe, that particular view, but certainly kind of pro-child, and understanding that women have clearly defined roles, and that's not in the workplace. It's not outside of the home. A woman's primary God ordained role is as wife and mother. And so they really emphasize gender difference And there's a word that they use, complementarian. So men have roles and they complement women's roles, but that obscures the fact that these are hierarchical relationships as much as they may want to deny it. Because part of a man's role is to exert authority over his wife and children. And you see that very plainly in some of the clips here as well. And it is a woman's role to take care of the children and submit to that masculine leadership. And you can see then how it's extremely difficult for women to be in a position where they can resist abuse, especially when it's coming from a man in authority over them, either as a father or as a pastor or a youth pastor. It's even difficult for women to identify this as abuse because they are
Mm.
so used to being taught it is your duty to submit to the men God has placed in your life.
Wow. And I just, it's called For Our Daughters. And what you said is these women, what really engaged them and motivated them to speak out was having daughters of their own. So I'm just very curious. What is it going to take for women to speak out for themselves? Not just to have to, because Joe and I are moms too, of daughters. And so I know I know Joe really well. Like we would definitely speak out for our daughters, but what's it going to take for us to speak out for ourselves? You know what I mean?
That is such a powerful question. And interestingly, not one I've been asked inside these Christian spaces. And I'll give a very quick story about the title. It came both from the women in the film, two of whom mentioned the role of having daughters of themselves that allowed them to see it wasn't my fault. I was that age. They're able to see more clearly what actually happened to them. But also, that title came from a conversation I had just a few months after Jesus and John Wayne released, when three conservative women, whose names I recognize from inside these conservative spaces, asked to have a private Zoom conversation with me. I thought they were going to, want to critique my book. It could come across as a little harsh, maybe nuance some things. That wasn't what they wanted to do. They said, "Kristin, thank you for what you've done." And they said, "It's too late for us. We've made our choices and we are living the lives that we've made for ourselves, but we want something different for our daughters." And that was just so moving and so sad. And also, I knew I had to just keep doing this work.
I mean, I like want to cry. I want to ugly cry right now because that is heartbreaking. And Jill and I had a conversation yesterday with co-authors of a book, talking about basically giving children bodily autonomy, with this sense of from a very early age, right? So I actually think that conversation is very complementary to,
Yeah.
not to use that word in the negative way, to this conversation, because those women, heartbreakingly, right? That's what they were conditioned to accept and to understand. And they, it was through no fault of their own that was what they were subjected to. But being able to recognize that they don't want that for their daughters is massive, but them feeling like they can't pull that part of themselves out is also so heartbreaking. But in a weird way, it does give you a sense of hope, in a weird way, because they're breaking that cycle just by identifying this for their daughters, by you having these conversations, for you writing that book, making that documentary, for this conversation unfolding and giving those daughters the chance to have that sense of autonomy that systemically that the women in those communities never had.
Exactly. And that's the hope, to bring more exposure. And already the film hasn't even been out for a week. And I've already received so many notes and letters from women who've seen it saying, "This happened to me. Thank you for helping me now, giving me a tool to explain to others what those dynamics were." I've heard from men saying, "Thank you, this happened to my daughter," or "This happened to my granddaughter. And now I have a better understanding of what that was. And I can now show this to people to say, this is what she was up against."
Oh my gosh. And then I want to circle back to Project 2025, which you mentioned before, because people in this evangelical space and the people who are reaching out to you understand this. It happened to me. I've seen it happen to other people, but people who maybe are not in that space don't quite understand the power dynamic there. And the thing is, with Project 2025, and if you get a Trump Vance into office and you keep a Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House, this is what's going to be projected on the whole country. So,
Absolutely.
what kind of warnings do you have for people who might not quite understand what this could look like?
I spent a lot of my time speaking on exactly this issue, on the threat to our democracy. Because the Christian nationalist agenda, which is about order and hierarchy and power and control, and it is about centering and privileging a particular type of Christianity over all other faith traditions, privileging this type of Christian citizens over all other Christian citizens. It's about interpreting our founding documents, our Constitution, in light of this particular ideological framework, right? Not according to protecting the rights of all. This is exactly what is on the ballot this November. You're right about Mike Johnson. He has been steeped in this tradition. Absolutely. When we look at the authors of Project 2025, when we look at somebody like Russ Vogt, and we look at the networks and the connections, and we look at the pastors, some of the pastors I feature here, and they're appearing on the stage of NatCon and they're on Tucker Carlson's show, what we see is these networks and these webs are thickening and they are aligning and they are connecting and they are directly linked now to the former Trump administration, to those who want to be in the next Trump administration, to Project 2025, and we can branch out to JD Vance as well, right? This is part of a movement, and this is exactly what we are voting on this November.
That's terrifying, and it's something we really do have to talk about and think about
Mhm.
all the time, unfortunately, because it's what we're facing. One of the things you also talk about is for them that the ends justify the means, and really, there's so much of this that is about that, and those means, they permeate all sorts of levels of society that are destabilizing at best.
Yes.
So, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. This ends justify the means mentality is pervasive here, and it's foundational to Christian nationalism because that kind of posits God is on our side, right? So everybody who's against any aspect of our agenda, they're not just against us; they're against God. And if that's the case, and they also love the language of threat, and we're embattled, and the left is out to get us, and this is our last stand, right? There's always this has been like extreme language of threat going back decades now. So it was the communists and it was radical Islam and it's always the Democrats and it's the gay agenda, right? There's always this imminent danger and that's the justification to consolidate their own power and to use this ends justifies the means mentality. And so that's why we see right now in conservative Christian communities an utter disregard for truth. Right. For those of us who grew up in these spaces, wait a minute, the threat was always the postmodern, abandonment of truth. And here you're saying that it doesn't matter. So when we hear somebody like JD Vance say, "Oh, yeah, I can make up these stories because it serves my political purposes." That is normal in these spaces. I actually just saw there's a lot of kind of smear campaigns against people who are resisting in these spaces, against survivors, attempts to discredit comes at me as well. Just last week, I saw a note from somebody where somebody was lying about me. Somebody else came in to defend me. And then a comment came under that saying, "She's an enemy. We can say what we want about her and do what we want to her." Right. And I saw that and screenshotted it. And I mean, it's chilling. And also I thought it's refreshing because I appreciate the clarity there because this is certainly what it feels like in some of these spaces. When you get into the right wing spaces, truth doesn't matter. They will use whatever they can as a weapon against you. And they will turn this against anybody who gets in the way of their agenda, and some of their primary targets are actually fellow Christians, right? So they really benefit in depicting this as Christians against the enemies of Christianity, but that's not at all what's going on. They just want to present it that way. Some of their real targets are fellow Christians who are disrupting this agenda.
Yeah, and we last week we talked to April Joy, who has a new book called Out Star Spangled Jesus. I think it came out yesterday. And something that she said that really stuck with me was that it's not about community, it's about conformity. So like everything you're saying right now, and
We're
I
talking
think
about the same people.
yeah,
Mhm.
and that's what they and like that's what they want for the whole country. They want to bring that conformity. And then I just want to go back to, people who maybe don't understand survivors, and you hear some people say, well, why didn't you speak up when it happened? Why didn't you tell anybody? Which just makes me cringe. But this is why. I mean, one many reasons, right? But one reason is like that fear, well, that questioning yourself, like, oh, did I do something to deserve this? And that fear of retaliation and all that kind of stuff. So the bravery of these women in the film, could you just talk about that a little bit?
Oh, I mean, that is huge. And these survivors, they did actually come out, at the moment of their abuse, they brought it to their pastors, right? And what were they told? Tiffany Thigpen was asked immediately, "Have you told anybody else?" She said, "No, I'm just telling you." Good, don't tell anybody else, right? And then the attacks start coming in, the attempts to discredit. These women are incredible, and in fact, it was important to me when I invited women to participate in this film, to only invite those who were already out on the front lines on their own terms. Because unless you've experienced this and the backlash and the hate that comes your way, like you really don't know, even if you think you know. And I did not want the film itself to be what brought a woman into this space in such a public way, knowing how vicious it could get. So I wanted to stick with women who I knew exactly what I was asking them to do and were doing it willingly. But I'll say one more thing too. Like this is scary stuff, and yes, it keeps me awake at night. So I try to keep other people awake at night too, because this really matters. It's not that every evangelical holds these views, certainly to this extreme, not at all. But many, many are complicit in these church communities in going along with what they're told, in covering things up, in protecting their pastors, in not speaking up for the women who are being pushed to the side, who are being demonized, who are keeping their heads down, who are buying into this rhetoric that if you are a Christian, you must side with us and you must vote this way. And and so one of the things that this film wants to do is reach inside those Christian spaces with the powerful stories of these women in their own words, to show them what they're participating in and call them to something better.
you I want to pick up on that because you talk about how this is not a departure from Jesus to speak up, but the opposite. To On the contrary, this is like a return to what Jesus actually taught. Full disclosure, I'm also a Christian. The teachings of Jesus do not say abuse thy daughter. It's just so that that is the avenue to reaching those who are complicit, right? To reaching those who just keep their heads in the sand, well, they're sort of abiding and holding their tongues while this departure from Jesus continues to unfold before them. Like, I think that there's a really, I mean, I don't know how entrenched they are, right? But because of that idea that it is really truly the opposite of the teachings of Jesus, I feel like that's an opportunity to reach them.
Yeah, that's exactly what we were thinking, because the film is it's dark, right? It's disturbing. And to reach the women inside these spaces, we did want to remind them that there are resources within their own belief system, within their own faith tradition, that should embolden them to stand up against this. And I want to respect the fact that, although all of the women in this film grew up in Christian spaces, some understandably are quite distanced from those spaces today, with that, which I want to affirm that's a completely legitimate response to what they've walked through. And some are still working on the inside. All are trying to bring reform, right? So there's kind of people are ending up in different places. But we did want to speak to a different kind of Christianity. And I'm a person of faith myself. I teach at a Christian university, and the pastor at the end, who was offering this different vision of Christianity, that this isn't about Christianity's never been about power. That was actually the temptation of Christ, to claim earthly power. Right? Christ is about the opposite. And Jesus never treated women in this way. Really digging into the theology, the traditional Christian theology. Pastor Len, he's actually my pastor. He's the pastor of the church that I attend, long time pastor. And right, this is a Christianity that I embraced. And so I don't know, maybe I'm getting Christianity wrong and they're all getting it right. So I don't want to say this is the true Christianity, right? I'm a historian. That's a theological claim. But, as a Christian, I'll make that theological claim and at least want to speak to other Christians on their terms and have them take another look at the
Mm,
scriptures that you claim to hold dear and tell me, which Jesus do you see here?
mhm,
Yeah, and Kristen, I like the way you talk about like I feel like there's a creativity there, like a vision, like let's vision a better way. And I feel like that like the Harris Walls campaign, I feel like is kind of bringing that energy and that joy of like visioning something different. So I'm just curious from you, after writing Jesus and John Wayne and doing the film and talking to so many people, what is your vision for a better way for our future?
Yeah. I actually I've been watching with great interest both the Harris Walls campaign and some of the faith groups speaking out in support of the campaign. And I have a particular eye on evangelicals for Harris for obvious reasons, and watching some of their rhetoric. And they're actually quite skilled in a way that I will say Democrats have not been very skilled at reaching these communities and speaking on their terms. Certainly not into more conservative white communities. But the Evangelicals for Harris folks, I think they're getting it right. They just had an ad that released yesterday about Carly, a girl who was a kind of a Jesus kid, wore the Jesus T-shirts. If you're in evangelical spaces, like April would recognize this, right? We know the type. Um, and then who was bullied in high school for it, and it was her teacher Tim Walls who came to her defense. And
mm,
as the ad said, or she said in the ad, he affirmed my identity as a Christian and he had my back. That's what we need, right? This is not Christians against non-Christians. And Christians also have a place in our democracy. Absolutely. And as do people of all faiths, as do people of no particular faith. And so anytime we are feeding into this polarizing rhetoric, we are actually playing into the hands of the right, this reactionary movement, because they win that game every time. And in fact, this is not the way most of us live our lives, right? We get along with our neighbors. We get along with the public schools our kids go to are actually good schools. We live well in our communities, but up here, the political rhetoric tries to convince us something else. And I think it's really important that we work to diffuse that and to hold up examples on all sides, right, that are showing us who we really are. And so I love the approach that they're taking on that front as well.
mm. Yeah, it's also who we are and who we want to be. I think that that's this huge component of it for me personally. It's that when I look around and I see, like you said, that discourse up there that just doesn't look like, not coming from the right, doesn't look like who I want us to be, who I want to show my children we are. There's this aspirational component to it as well. That we are better. We are, like you said, at the end of the day, like we do break bread with our neighbors, like we go to baseball games and we get along, and that's who we want to be.
And this is so good for Christians too, and for conservative Christians. The other thing I loved about the ad is Christians, conservative Christians especially, have really emphasized religious liberty, by which they mean, any infringement upon their rights to live as they see, what is faithful in all areas of life. And we could discuss the nuances of that and how often they apply that to other folks as well. But when I thought about that, I thought, much of what we're kind of litigating in society is not actually in the courts and it's not around constitutional issues. It's about how we treat each other. And the posture of battling for rights and depicting that as a zero-sum game. Now, rights are important and we should defend the Constitution. There's much more that we need to be doing. And what we need to be doing is cultivating civility and
Mhm.
mutual respect and reaching across and showing people who we really are. And that the problem is reactionary movements thrive on making that disappear and making people think it doesn't exist. They thrive on making people think that you have to fight, that this is a zero sum game, and that if you don't grab the power, somebody else will. Right. And that undermines our deliberative democracy. And we have to really work and find ways to shore that up, to defend basic civil rights across the board, even for people we don't like, and to treat people with that dignity and respect and find ways to work against that incredibly powerful rhetoric and propaganda that is reaching people day in, day out.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think, one of the first steps is understanding it, and so I think that the film is just kind of, like, maybe waking people up to that, of, like, this is what's happening. If this happened, if you're someone that this happened to, or somebody, you're not wrong. Like, it's
Yeah.
not your fault. Like,
Mhm.
this is something that has happened, and we all need to speak out against it.
Transparency, honesty. I just want
Yeah.
people to listen to these stories and sit with those stories.
Yeah, exactly. So, Kristen, before we wrap up, where can people watch the film?
So, we wanted to make this film accessible to everyone, barrier free, especially to the women who most need it. So, we just put the film right out on YouTube. You can go to forourdaughter'sfilm.com and you can find the film there and the trailer and all sorts of resources for survivors and for different folks to do better in their own churches and institutions. Books on the subject, and we have discussion guides. We're really hoping that people host watch parties with their friends. We're already starting to see that in church groups. It's super easy to do. The film is free. It's a half an hour long, so it's made to watch in community, talk about with your friends, and invite other people in, and then see if they can spread it in their spaces.
Yeah. Well,
Mm.
thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you for your work. And I just want to let everybody know that Kristen is on our limited series podcast called Sacred Politics that you can find with Red Wine and Blue. She was an incredible guest on that. So, and Joe, do you have anything else that you want to end with?
No, I just thank you. I mean, the conversations that we've had the last 2 days have been so empowering, so uplifting, so forward looking, but like,
Mhm.
reaffirming really. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, everybody, for watching. And check us out at redwine.blue. Thank you.